Welcome to this IMF panel discussion. My name is Eleni Giakos. I'm a correspondent for CNN. Thank you so very much for joining us. I'm just going to wait just a few seconds so that all of you can join us. But we still have a few people sitting in the waiting room. And as we get online, we will then kick off the conversation. It's fantastic. The numbers are increasing. I'm so glad you were able to make it today to join us for this very pertinent conversation. I think we're good to go. So thank you for joining us from close and from far, from people in the United States to the Middle East and here in Africa. Just a quick note, if you'd like to listen to this conversation in Arabic, please see the bottom right side of your screen. There's a little toggle, a translation button. Please click on that and you'll be able to listen to this conversation in Arabic. Rekia will help guide you in Arabic now. Rekia? Rekia, are you there? Okay, she's still on mute. Are you there?
The webinar will be in English and there is simultaneous interpretation into Arabic, and you can use Arabic interpretation.
Thank you very much for that, Rekia. Just a note to the audience as well, please, very important, turn off your video camera as well as mute yourself. We might get an interruption in the conversation if you keep your camera and your microphone on, so please kindly mute those options. All right, our topic for today, improving governance and fighting corruption for inclusive growth in the Middle East as well as North Africa. The IMF have just released a paper detailing some of their findings and ways to combat corruption and improve governance in the region, both vital for securing economic prosperity as well as inclusive growth. Now, while we have seen improvements, gaps remain between policy and successfully implementing reforms in some countries, as well as public perception. That remains weak in some countries as well. With much greater social and health spending underway to combat the impact of the pandemic and with strained balance sheets, ensuring no spillage and wastage occurs, it is important in winning public trust on where the money is going and, of course, how it is being spent. Corruption can put social cohesion at risk, and we're reminded by the past, and in fact, this is the 10th year anniversary of the Arab Spring. It conjures up deep emotions of the plighted people who experienced harsh economic realities of inequalities, social and economic inequalities. And now, in the midst of an unprecedented global crisis, people must feel that money is being funneled into a better future for all. So in the words of the IMF MD, Kristalina Georgieva, spend what you need, but keep the receipts. Very important to remember that. So today we aim to answer, how can strong governance of economic institutions curb corruption? What reforms can be undertaken to promote inclusive growth and ensure government spending is reaching those who need it? And what is the role of digitalization in facilitating these efforts and increasing transparency, of course? So please note, we will be allocating a fair amount of time for taking questions from you, the audience. Please pose your questions in the tab on your screen. We'd love to hear from you, and I'll be posing those questions on behalf of you. Also, please use the hashtag MENA to engage with us on social media. And of course, you're able to comment there as well. So it is now my pleasure to welcome our panelists today, and we have a fantastic group of minds giving us insights into this very important topic that we're tackling today. Jihad Azur, Director of Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF. Murad Wahba, Associate Administrator at Interim United Nations Development Programme. Dima Dwehan, Executive Director, Middle East and North Africa Region Office at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. Adil Malik, Associate Professor in Development Economics at Oxford University. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us today, and I look forward to your insights. Our first theme, we will be addressing what the key priorities are for improving economic governance and fighting corruption in the Middle East and North Africa. And Mr. Azur, I'd like to start off with you. It's great to see you virtually. I know our last interaction was in Washington, DC, but I'm glad we're still able to have this conversation in the midst of a crisis. And as I mentioned, the IMF has published a paper on governance and anti-corruption reforms in the MENA region. Could you state for us what the main findings were that will help foster inclusive growth?
If you look at the governance as a pyramid, at the top you have institutions. And those institutions on the economic front are the fiscal institutions, the central banks, and other agencies. And therefore, here we saw that a certain number of countries have improved on those institutional setup, have introduced new laws to make their central bank more independent. But there are still certain issues to be addressed in order to strengthen the role of the institution. Institutions are important because they are at the essence of the trust between citizen and state. The second layer is what I would call the operating model or the operating system, the rules, the regulations, the procedures. And here also we see a big diversity among countries. Addressing those by tackling risks of corruption, by improving the effectiveness of laws, regulations, will allow countries in the region to improve revenues, for example, to provide better services to their citizens, to provide additional stability in terms of investment and increase the level of investment and job creation. And here also the study shows where the priorities are and how countries need to tackle it. The third layer is the transparency and the accountability part. Citizens need to see. And this is an area where there are certain gaps that can be filled very quickly in terms of transparency in the budget, in terms of the level of information statistics that are being published and the accuracy of those, the independence of those who provide them. This is very important because this is how you provide, I would say, read on your real economy and how the economy is performing. But this is also how you provide to your citizen information on the way their resources have been utilized. Addressing corruption is an important issue along the line from institution to operation to the way public procurement is being done to the way information is being shared. The last two dimensions that became even more important after the COVID-19 crisis are to participation. And here there are a certain number of initiatives that took place in the last few years in terms of increasing the level of citizen participation in budget setting. But I think we can do more. And the second dimension is technology. Technology proved to be, during this COVID-19 crisis, an important bright spot, whereby it helped several countries address the issues of COVID, but also provide additional support to citizens. I see these two elements as an important dimension going forward in the future. What we've tried to do also in this study is to be as quantitative as possible, trying to use multiplicity of indicators in order to help countries measure their performance and set clear and practical objectives in improving their level of governance and fighting corruption. Fighting corruption and improving governance, it's a lifelong type of priority, and it takes time to achieve those objectives. But I think we cannot envisage a strong and sustainable recovery post-COVID without having a strong governance framework.
Thank you so very much for that, Mr. Azur, and really fascinating to hear some of those insights out of the report. And isn't it interesting that we've been seeing the pandemic shedding light on some of the most important trends going forward? And you mentioned technology as a solution, but also just dealing with the issue of corruption and improving economic governance, which, Mr. Wahba, we know is not just a pertinent issue facing, countries in the MENA region, but it's a worldwide problem. We've seen the private sector being embroiled in corruption problems. We've seen multiple countries facing the same things. And what happens then is that it can lead to kind of social unrest, which bubbles under the surface. The discontent bubbles under the surface. But when it comes to the MENA region, what makes it particularly urgent for countries within the region to address these problems? And what would you say is different about the region in tackling this?
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon, all. And let me first really thank the IMF and Jihad for inviting me to this meeting, because beyond the usual courtesies, I think the paper that you've produced comes at a very, very important time for the region. We're on the cusp of recovery, and how we do it really will depend on public trust and on the quality of, among other things, financial management. But to look at your question, Eleni, perhaps why is the region different? I think the region is different because if you look at the various transparency indices, and the paper has some, but there are others also, the region is lagging behind other areas of the world. And I've tried to think about why there was the specificity of the region. I think perhaps three elements. The first is political instability. And we had an earlier conversation on whether this is a stable region or not. And the region is so diverse that there have been major sort of cases of fragility in the region, ranging from countries in active conflict, where there are active theaters, to countries who've just seen either changes of regime or revolutions against established patterns of governance. This then is one element that mitigates efforts of anti-corruption and really sort of supports a lack of transparency in the management of public finance. A second, perhaps, cause of that is on the rent-seeking nature of many of the economies in the region. I think when there is sort of a source of funding coming up through rent, say through oil exports, for instance, or through financial transfers, not to single out the oil exporters of the region, this also allows perhaps for lack of control. And the third element, and I'll stop there if I may, is the peculiar sort of social contract we've seen in this region, whereby a lack of democracy was compensated for, in the views of the citizens, by access to resources, access to subsidies, supporting livelihoods, saying, we'll give you all these resources, but you also let us govern as we see fit. So all three elements, I think, go against it. And it's not to say this is hopeless. I believe that your paper, Jihad, really does show the way forward in public finance. My argument is public financial management, transparency in the management of resources, of financial resources, must be matched by greater political transparency and a greater voice for the voiceless. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wapa. I'm going to touch on that a little later in our second round of questions, but thank you for those insights. Mr. Malik, and I alluded to this during the introduction, pandemic spending. The big question here, governments are spending, are they governments spending effectively? The economic fallout for people on the ground is just so enormous that people want to feel and have confidence that their governments are doing their very best. What is the role of better economic governance and fighting corruption in this context? And how will it help with the recovery? Because after the spending, if you haven't kept the receipts, there's going to be audits, and then you're going to have an enormous debt burden that you'll have to contend with, where people have to pay that back. So the economic consequences could be big if there isn't transparency and governance here.
Yes, that's a very important question. But let me begin by again thanking Jihad and yourself for this kind session and invitation. Clearly, I think the prime issue in terms of spending in times of pandemic is targeting. How do we target social spending in the right way so that it reaches the intended beneficiaries? And I think in that regard, I think the pandemic has exposed prior inequalities in public spending and provisions, but it has also reactivated government attempts towards retargeting, and that's where digitization has played a very important role. Many of the MENA countries have been given a rare opportunity to upgrade their social spending regimes. Prior to the pandemic, we obviously had large access and coverage to basic programs. But I think post-pandemic, there has been a lot of pressure on governments to deliver to segments that are not always included. And this includes the very important informal sector, because in large number of developing countries, a significant proportion of the population works in the informal sector. There has been discussion about direct cash transfers, about directly reaching out to the poor, and that's where some of the efforts are coming together. I would, however, like to emphasize that this pandemic exposed the MENA region to rather something special, which is that prior to the pandemic, the region was already exposed to low oil prices and conflict. And in some countries, particularly Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon, it was exposed to anti-corruption protests. You know, there's the Iraq, it was essentially anti-corruption protests. So if anything, the governments faced even more pressure to deliver. Now, like any crisis, there are always opportunities in them, right? And the way you respond in the crisis could have path-dependent consequences, in the sense that you put in place new initiatives and motions, new kinds of programs, interventions, which could have long delay impact. The crises are also special moments in the sense that this is when governments are specially incentivized. Elite incentives matter a great deal. So if you've seen the response in UAE, you've seen the response in Jordan, a whole range of other countries where the rulers were particularly keen to get things delivered, right? Because this is the moment when elite incentives become particularly aligned with delivery. So you have, in a sense, a rare opportunity to what Murad said, you know, resetting the social contract. It all depends on how this pans out in future. We're already seeing that oil prices might rise. If oil prices rise a lot, you could then again go back to the slumber that we have previously witnessed. So there are both opportunities and challenges, and corruption, certainly anti-corruption, sits at the heart of it.
Thank you, Mr. Malik. Ms. Rehan, we were talking about, I mean, clearly transparency and accountability is basically the cornerstone of dealing with corruption. And it was interesting in the paper, one of the things that came up is that for some countries, the public doesn't even have access or even know what is exactly going on in annual budgets for countries. Very different for advanced economies in the region, very different for low-income countries and conflict countries in the region. So again, a very diverse set of things that we're seeing. But in terms of your perspective and as an advocate for increasing the voice of the public, what are the most pressing issues in this area? What are you hearing on the ground? Tell me what you think needs to happen. Mr. Rehan, are you there? You're on mute. The curse of being on this type of technology. Great, welcome. Great to see you.
Okay. First, I'd like to start by thanking the IMF for the invite to take part in this distinguished panel, and also to you for moderating and to discuss this timely issue from a civil society perspective. One of the pressing issues, as everyone mentioned, the need not only for accountability and transparency, but also for achieving public trust. And we believe that this can be enhanced by enhancing means for public participation. To be able to channel the voice of the public and also address their needs, there is a need to look at the ways civil society actors and organizations role in the policy making. And when we talk about the role of civil society and public participation, we're not discussing a point of luxury. It's basically one of the fundamental rights acknowledged in the ICCPR, the International Convention for Civil and Political Rights, and it also acknowledged in the Arab Charter for Human Rights. In the context of the pandemic, it was stressed as one of the key elements for a successful response by the Office of the Higher Commissioner for Human Rights. Public participation for civil society in the policymaking is something that organizations can, or civil society as a sector, can take part in the three phases of public policy making. They can basically contribute to the design of the policy, the implementation, and also oversight. So how to make this effective and meaningful for civil society to voice the needs for the public, and also to actively engage in the policy making? It can be achieved by basically enforcing mechanisms and institutionalizing mechanisms for public participation. This means that the role of civil society has to be recognized as essential and a key partner in the policymaking process, as I explained when I started. And for civil society to also inform the policy making, not only institutionalized public policy mechanisms should be in place. And when I say institutionalized public policy mechanisms, we are talking about acknowledging this right as a constitutional right in the Constitution, or through laws such as that basically facilitate participation by civil society, such as public consultation laws, such as laws for motions and petitions, and other means and ways where civil society can participate, whether through formal processes or, for example, through digital technology. And the main element for a successful public participation for civil society in the policy making is basically when they are operating within an enabling environment, an enabling legal environment that basically, again, not only recognizes and enables the sector as a key partner, but also does not impose undue restrictions to its operation and objectives.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Did you want to add anything?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me give you an example on the context of the pandemic. Countries in the region that had in place formal public participation mechanisms, we saw successful examples for civil society working together with governments in responding to the pandemic, and also in informing these measures and helping them, assisting them in the response measures. So, for example, in Tunisia, we saw this collaboration between the government and also civil society organizations and local communities that is called JISR. It basically helped channel all the aid and assistance to the local communities at the early time of the pandemic. and organizations, not only the ones working on humanitarian and assistance, but also ones working on policy and advocacy and capacity building. They worked with the government officials, building their capacity on how to respond and how to channel the centralized fund, let's say, or mechanism for the responding to the pandemic, to basically make the assistance arrive or reach the very much in need in the local communities. And this is because in Tunisia, a country like Tunisia, civil society is acknowledged as a partner in policy making. Another country like Jordan, for example, although there are no formal mechanisms, but we saw how informed civil society organizations could provide propositions and the design of the policy and the drafting of the instructions for the trust fund that was allocated, Himmat Watan, for responding to the pandemic. Organizations working on accountability and transparency proposed recommendations to the government of Jordan on how to allocate and spend the money that was allocated for the government response. And when the instructions came out as a formal government document, most of these propositions were basically taken into consideration. And now these organizations are not in a place where they're advocating against these instructions because they weren't shared earlier. No, they are now taking the role of a sector that monitors, provides feedback, and also assess the implementation of these instructions and how much they are adhering to the principles of accountability and transparency.
Mr. Rehan, you were fantastic in giving us so much insights. And in fact, you've basically really tackled our next theme, which centers around the roles of the different stakeholders. So the private sector, government, you spoke about civil society and the impact it can have, but you have to have a willing government to want to listen to the general public. So I want to go to you, Mr. Malik. And, you know, this is complex conversation. It's not a new conversation, but we know what needs to be done. And from what we basically know, that the groundwork, the foundation is having a willing and open government to do that. So let's talk about the challenges that you foresee right now and what we can do to address these to ensure that we can root out corruption.
Right. This is indeed a very multifaceted, difficult problem. But I think as an academic, I would like to preface my discussion by at least emphasizing that corruption is essentially a political problem. It's an institutional problem. And I think there's no better place to think about it than the Middle East. Consider two countries, Lebanon and Iraq. Corruption today in both of these countries emanates from the sectarian political settlement, right? Which allocates political and economic power based on sectarial ethnic representations. That's the original sin. Now, that makes fighting corruption an extremely difficult prospect. One of the things that we know as academics is that corruption tends to thrive in settings where there are particularistic relationships, when there are clientelistic relationships. We also know that a lot of countries have come up with anti-corruption initiatives, and they are also political in nature, in the sense that they could be selective, the rules could be defined to nab some people who are not very pleasant for rulers. We also know that there is mixed evidence on corruption. There are countries that have succeeded despite some type of corruption existing. You know, the latest book on China's Gilded Age is a prime example. One aspect in this, which is particularly relevant for the Middle East, it's not been discussed in the report, but it's part of our book, project on crony capitalism in the Middle East, is that corruption is the abuse of a public office for private gain. But there are some privileges that are legal privileges that may not be considered as corruption, but in the public imagination, it is corruption, right? So for example, if you set up a monopoly, or if the state has access to land and that preferential access is granted to certain big businesses, it is a form of corruption. And therefore, the word rents or the term rent seeking is very crucial for thinking about corruption. Now, with that question, I think it's important for us to recognize and be humble about the prospect of fighting corruption, because it's a political issue, it's not a technocratic issue. And it makes institutions like the International Monetary Fund in a very difficult situation in terms of what to argue, right? And that's why I think the report very sensibly highlighted a number of areas where change is possible. And one of this is obviously relates to informational imperfections, because remember, corruption ultimately emerges from some people having more information and control and discretion than others. So any attempt through digitization or public access of information could be useful in empowering the public in terms of letting them know where resources are being spent, where they're going. Digitization could be helpful in reducing the complexity of laws, because Louis Zingales has that excellent quote where he says, the size and complexity of regulation is a huge part of the problem that makes the system susceptible to political abuse. And also, I think through digitization, if you provide access to information, particularly on budget, a key part of the report is dedicated to lack of transparency in terms of public finances. I mean, if you look at all across the world, and there's an open budget survey, the MENA countries have one of the lowest scores in terms of transparency of information on some very basic funding items, right? And so that's something that the IMF rightfully is emphasizing. Another is procurement. Now, procurement, again, you could have laws, and there are a lot of countries from Africa to Asia that have seen, okay, here are the best practices on procurement, we set up the laws, but then remember, there are certain interest groups who benefit from procurement. In Lebanon, for example, or in Iraq, there are companies, or even in Turkey, in Pakistan, lots of countries, you find procurement is systematically used by elite actors to reward themselves. Now, that's not going to be just a matter of improving laws. It requires, as Dima said, larger societal coalitions that have a direct stake in constraining the hands of the ruler and tying the hands of the ruler. And before this discussion becomes longer, I want to finish it very quickly with two more points, which are particularly relevant for the MENA region, where there's scope for improvement. One is inconsistent implementation of laws. We have now a lot of evidence to suggest that enforcement itself has become a domain of privilege, in the sense that if there are laws that apply to everyone, some firms or some parties have a better go at implementation of those laws than others. So there's a lot of scope for reducing the bridge between the de jure and the de facto. And the second element, where there's huge scope for reform, where actually the elite incentives at the present moment might be aligned, might be prepared to implement reform, is actually the financial sector. Because that's where you see a lot of exposure of the banking system to connected actors. There are gaps in supervision arrangements. There are conflicts of interest. There are non-performing loans. We don't know what stays on the book. In Algeria, for example, there's massive non-performing loan portfolio. It has remained on the books for a long period of time, but we don't know. But again, it's not going to be a matter of laws, because those who have benefited from those non-performing loans would always oppose tooth and nail against an audit of what those non-performing loans are.
Thank you for that. You're right. I mean, look, to truly root out corruption, because it's not just a crime, it's about people and government officials taking advantage of vulnerabilities that exist in the system. So you need to have willingness to be able to do away with that. Just a quick note to our audience members, please put your questions into the chat box. I will be going to those in just a little while. We are running out of time. Ms. Rehan, if you could just very quickly tell me, very quick terms, the best practices that we should try and strive to see in the region during this time of crisis.
Sorry.
Muted.
Yeah. I mean, the best practices, well, I mean, there is a lot of, again, like as I started, we see very good examples in the region where we see there is room for all sectors, including the civil society sector, work together towards, achieving reforms and also like growth in the political, social, and economic, scope. So basically, in Morocco, for example, as we said, and in Tunisia, these examples are already in place. Organizations like ICNL and other international organizations, they work at the international level to address also and make available the input for civil society with respect even to these international obligations on countries in the MENA and worldwide. For example, the Financial Action Task Force, I saw in the report that one link to fighting corruption is basically also fighting money laundering and terrorism financing. And organizations like ICNL worked closely with these international institutions like FATF to make sure that the input from civil society is now being considered. The Financial Action Task Force now have a place on their website to take input from civil society to basically help not only this international evaluation institution, but also as they work in their government, with their governments at the country level, to make sure that any impact of these of policies taken to comply with these international obligations are known, and there is some level of outreach to the public, and also whatever financial institutions adopt as policies. Other groups, like for example the NPO or the not-for-profit organization sector, basically can clarify how this impacts their operation. So when international organizations work and enhance the role of civil society, not only the environment, the legal environment in which they work, but also their role in working on design and also informing public policy, we can see that they are not only engaging at the local level and the regional level, but also, or the national level, but also they are working at the international level in a manner that makes complying to these international obligations in the MENA region and in any other country kind of inclusive to all and understood by all.
For the sake of time, I'm going to move on, and we'll have questions from the audience in a short while. Mr. Wahba, I want to talk about the consequences if we do not continue to improve governance, because we know it takes time. It takes a lot of continuous effort for it to be durable and successful. And I know the UN has been it's been at the core of a lot of what you do, is you're approaching this issue to try and ensure that there's progress made. What do you think government should be doing right now for reform? Because as we've established, social cohesion is at risk, and of course, inequalities that bubble under the surface can turn out to be a very big issue down the line for weaker economies.
Thank you, Eleni. Let me try something with you, which is, if governments have the will, and how that will is generated, perhaps then is an open question, whether it's through internal democratic processes, whether it's through internal pressure, whether it's through the influence of international organizations, of major donors to the region, is a separate question. But once one establishes the will to have a more transparent model for public financial management, say, or for anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing, etc., I think there's a question of capacity that arises. And I think Dima referred to it earlier. One of the tasks, I think, of the international community is to support the development of capacities of civil society, but also of private enterprise, of government departments, to find out corruption, to analyze it, and eventually to root it out. And that is a technical issue beyond the political. A second area, which I've always found very interesting, so forgive me if I go into that in a bit greater detail, is post-crisis, post-conflict reconstruction. Because while conflict or crisis, and I include there, I think the COVID crisis, I would definitely include that in there, is a catastrophic phenomenon, and I'm using the term advisedly, a catastrophic phenomenon in societies. The reconstruction, the rebuilding of society allows one to put in place both the laws that limit corruption, that enhance transparency, but also the mechanisms that help citizen groups, either civil society or private enterprise, I think there was a question in the chat, to know that it's happening and to be able to observe, to root it out, and to serve their purpose, if you like, as watchdogs. So I think a post-crisis, post-conflict, I'm thinking of the situation in the Lebanon, I'm thinking of the situation, say, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, where you've had all these sort of post-crisis movements towards greater transparency. A third element, I have four, so please blame, is the national and the subnational levels.
Yes.
I believe sort of that moving away some of the decision-making to subnational levels makes it more transparent, if you like, to local communities to be able to manage the resources in their communities. So while one focuses very much on budgetary matters, on oversight of parliament, etc., at the national level, I think just as importantly is to go to the last mile to look at local community governance and to see how that is managed, whether that is corrupt, and what is the role of citizens.
Are you saying start bottom up, or, you know,
I'm saying do both, I'm afraid.
You like both? Okay.
I wish life was simple, but I'm saying do both. Look at the national level, but also enhance transparency at the subnational level.
But here's the thing, Mr. Wiper, I just quickly on that, you know, when we talk about rooting out corruption and to create confidence on the ground, and you're talking about political will, you're also talking about politicians not wanting to suddenly line their pockets, or at least being rooted out of government and then at least being, you know, facing the courts and facing the law, right? So it's such a huge process in rooting that out. Am I right in saying that to truly do this, you've got to fix institutions, but there also needs to be consequences?
Oh yes, very much so. There definitely need to be consequences. But in an institution which is by nature, I think Adil alluded to that in his comments, which is by nature itself lacking in transparency. I mean, I don't want to use the word corrupt, but lacking in transparency. That shift is going to have to come either from domestic pressure, and strong domestic pressure, or from a post-catastrophic event, again, I'm thinking of the Lebanon, or from the outside. And there, I think of the need for development finance, for instance. Final question, if I may.
Yeah.
Well, that's a question more than a comment, which is what is actually the link between democracy and transparency? Because we've seen countries where we have, should we say, a limited scope for democracy. And I'm going to mention one outside the region. I'm going to think of Rwanda, for instance, and yet very transparent management of public finances. So how do you, going beyond the obvious generalization that, you know, more democracy will allow for greater transparency, for greater citizen control over public finances, to, is in fact a directive leader or a directive government for that matter, perhaps as effective in rooting out corruption as a more democratic one? It's a question I've always wondered, and I'm just sharing it with you.
Jihad, Mr. Azur, do you want to answer that? Because it's a good one. It's a vital question, and I know the IMF does surveillance. You do technical assistance. You've been aggressive in fighting corruption over the past few years, more aggressively than before through a new program. You're now giving emergency funding out, so you're not able. I mean, from what I'm understanding, you're saying, okay, we need to get this money out. Are you doing the back end work to ensure that there isn't, you know, this money isn't ending up where it's not supposed to? And again, it comes up. Democracy versus transparency, what is the link? Tell us.
Well, it's a very interesting question. Let me say this is not a new issue. If you go back in history, Ibn Khaldun, back in the 14th century, the Tunisian philosopher, had excellent writings that if you read them, they are still, I would say, very valid today. Therefore, this is as the essence of societal organization, of political system, whatever the political system is. I believe in the importance of the moment. I think we have a moment today. And the moment today is we need to uplift our economies, our societies out of one of the most challenging crises that the world has gone through over the last century. And in those moments, you have opportunities. One of those opportunities is to address some of the issues that are, immediately, I would say, achievable. And this is what this study tried to do, is to try to identify a certain number of important, and yet in certain cases, technical issues, that if you address them, you improve the way you organize the economy or organize the society, the way you provide services, the way you have the best return on public money, which is the citizens' money, and the way also you include. Inclusion is not only by providing more services to people or more social protection, but also by increasing their level of participation. And this is what we are trying to do in this paper, and this is what the fund is trying to do currently. We believe it's a joint effort. We are one of the players. Of course, we need to be cognizant that we don't know everything, and there are certain dimensions like, for example, the legal dimensions, legislative dimensions. We know some of it when it comes to economic issues, but the judicial part is something that others are much better than us, and other organizations, including UNDP, civil society, and others. But also, we need deeper research. And I very much like what Adil was highlighting, the importance of also going deeper in terms of understanding the root cause of these issues. Where we could help is we could help at the technical level. We have widespread access to information on how to have best practices in economic management for the management of central banks and the financial system, where transparency is very important at the essence of the trust and the credibility, where fighting issues like money laundering are very important also to create stability. Corruption has different ways and means, and the financial system is one of the main conduits. Fiscal is very important not only because of the bottom line of it, i.e. the budget deficit or how resources are being used, because this is at the essence of any social and economic contract. And by improving fiscal institution, we can help citizens have more trust, but also make sure that also their resources are well used. Accountability starts with information, and information is technical. And this is something that can be also improved and we can help with. Thanks to the technology, this is something that can be spread widely and people can now benefit from it very easily. Last but not the least, I think we need to put things in perspective, in time. And this is what we are trying to do in our bilateral work with countries. When we do the consultation, what we call the Article 4, when we design programs, we try to put those milestones as guidelines for us in order to help countries achieve. It cannot be done in one step. Let's face it. Countries who succeeded, invested in it. It took them time, but they were consistent and they were determined. And I think this is where I feel that recently in our interaction with various authorities, we see improvements. We saw some improvement on some of the technical indicators and some of the doing business indicators. We saw new projects coming to fruition in terms of more independence to central banks, etc. I would go into a lot of details, but I would encourage people to read our report and see all these dimensions. But here, I think what we need to do is to provide a hand, a partnership to help those countries achieve it. And here, the wide level of stakeholders go beyond, I would say, the authorities, what we call the authorities, ministries and central banks and others. Civil society plays an important role, and we count on our partnership with them. Scholars play an important role, and we count on our partnership and benefiting from the knowledge of different universities and institutions. But also, this is something that we recognize it will take time, and we are cognizant of that, and we will make sure that in the design of our programs, of our engagement with countries, we will put this as an important priority. We have a new framework for that has been rejuvenated in order to be adapted to the needs of the countries. This is an important priority to the region. It has been recognized. It's the time now to move. And we at the fund, we are determined to help the countries in that.
Thank you so very much for that, Jihad. I'm going to go to questions. We have so many for you, Jihad, and for the rest of our panelists. I'm going to go to a question that's been posed directly to Adil, to Mr. Malik. And it's a question from Muhammad Ali Lutfi. And the question is regarding fighting corruption in the sake of ensuring inclusive growth. How can we make sure that no one of the vulnerable groups of civil society would be left behind? So what is your advice to these groups representing movements for ensuring successful enhancement and awareness-raising strategies of the region's elites? Interesting. So again, civil society needs to have a voice. It needs to be heard. And how can these voices be heard? What's the advice there, Adil?
Right. I mean, it all depends on the strengths of the civil society, the opportunity structures that are available, and the level of repression that some of the regimes could use. We know it's a very difficult, very thorny issue in the context of Middle East and North Africa, where the levels of repression are very high. But I think there could be possibilities, and some of you mentioned about Jordan, Dima, I think, mentioned about Jordan and Tunisia, where there are these opportunity structures. I think there are ways in which, these preferences could be aggregated, and that's where donors can play a very important role if they make it mandatory for a lot of aid that is coming through to the region. If it's mandatory, that some of these groups and their voices, their concerns could be taken into account. But just on the part of these groups, it's a difficult prospect. I think we have to think about the opportunities that are available and the levels of repression. I think it has to be an exercise which is very constructive and which requires capacity building from international donors.
Yeah. Dima, if you could give us a sense on, the example of Lebanon is just so interesting, and the question came through. There's no will from the state to do so, and there is a lack of independence of the judiciary. So how do you encourage civil society to take them, to take on the ruling elite, essentially, without putting your life at risk?
If I want to compare, just because we were talking, just right before the event about, how the region is diverse. Even like when I look at civil society in Lebanon, I would say that they are at least like maybe more robust and are more enabled than other, other countries in the region. So I would say that, and these are like maybe suggestions, a country like Lebanon, civil society is vocal, and they can, maybe they can start with not only capacity building, as we discussed before, but also with making these propositions. Now we know that Lebanon, for example, we have partners in Lebanon who are working on advocating for the parliament and also the government to adopt a public consultation law. And this basically takes into consideration making these parliamentary sessions public, and also other items related to the legislative process, and also related to government policies and processes. So when we have a group of organizations that can work in building capacity and forming some sort of advocacy, benefiting from international expertise, they can at least start somewhere with a proposition that they can build on and capitalize once the right moment comes in. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that. Jihad, I want you to tackle that question as well for me, please. And I'm going to add this onto it as well. It's from Raiden, an economist at the UN office in the UAE. A question on incentives for the private sector in actively combating corruption. Jihad, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, on that aspect, I think there are different dimensions that have been developed recently on that. There are, in terms of public procurement, new developments that in terms of understanding who are the economic beneficiaries, indirect beneficiaries, and other type of improvement in public procurement that allow everybody to be at the same, I would say, position in terms of competing. And therefore, we saw it in other parts of the world. Maybe in the beginning it requires an adjustment, but the private sector feels the benefit with time that being in an open and transparent competition helps. The second dimension, I think also over the last 10 years, we saw a very timid recovery in FDIs. And when you go deep, you see that law enforcement, transparency in the procedures, a certain number of even quality of information on the economy are impediments that put the investors a bit on the sideline and not being bullish in terms of investing and engaging long-term investment. And therefore, addressing this issue also allows the region to benefit more from investment. 3 is when you list companies in the stock market and you provide more regular information, more I would say detailed financial information that is audited and tested with rating agencies and others, this is also will provide additional trust and confidence in the system. Last but not the least, I think that the rule of law is very important. And economically speaking, there are certain number of improvements that were made. Technology also has helped in that front. In certain countries, the quality of public service have improved. Still, the quality of information provided still need to be improved and scaled up. Therefore, I don't see one size fit all for the region, but I see certain number of good practices that they have been tested and proved to be useful that the region can benefit from. And also, I think where the transition could take some time, in the long run, the private sector will benefit from a more transparent, clearer framework of operations.
Thank you very much for that. Murad, I want to talk about vaccine procurement. Governments right now globally are spending as much as they possibly can to procure vaccines, and in fact, procurement of PPE and all sorts of other things. I'm going to speak from personal experience in South Africa, where we've already had cases of major corruption when it comes to tenders and procurement. And of course, this is problematic, not only in a country like this, but in other countries as well. I wonder, when we look back on this year, when we have to, procure vaccines and work with various, private sector institutions, what do you think, in hindsight, we would have done wrong? And if we could look into the future, how can we perhaps take those issues and try and ensure we don't make those mistakes today?
Thanks, Eleni. I think just one preliminary remark. I think the levels of corruption in the health sector have been estimated at around $500 billion. Wow. So this is what we're talking about. This is the scale, if you like, of the problem. In the case of COVID, PPE procurement, therapeutics, and eventually, one hopes, vaccine procurement, I think part of the problem was very poor management of stocks in many countries, including, say, the United States, where I am now. But very, very poor management of stocks originally, and very poor levels of preparation. So I don't think it was a corruption problem as much as it was a management issue. But once we got into the procurement business, I think 2 things happened. First is that procurement tended, and again, not the only case, but tended to be limited to China, which had the largest capacity to stand up production very, very fast. And therefore, there was a bit of price arbitration within sort of private enterprises in China. The second problem that occurred to us, and I worked on procurement of PPE, etc., for a while, so speaking from personal experience, was defining qualities. And there, again, both in many countries actually, quality standards were compromised in a bid to procure very rapid stocks. So you had sort of ventilators that didn't ventilate, if I may, or PPE that didn't protect. The whole saga on different uses of masks and different qualities of masks, etc. And this is coming through now in terms of the procurement of therapeutics and vaccine, where there's enormous scope for, should we say, lower standard quality.
That's a very diplomatic way of saying it.
And finally, I think one element which I find absolutely fascinating, which is this lack of information. There's a whole sort of information pandemic that we've seen today, and there sort of outlets such as yours, Eleni, I think can play a major role in providing the right information. Because from sort of fake cures to, I don't know, illusions, as in my country, that there's some sort of immunity to COVID, which is, I don't know, due to the sun or some other element. And finally, the lack of information by government circles regarding the scale of the pandemic has also been, should we say, a problem of transparency.
Thank you for that. I'm going to start wrapping up now. And I've got a question that came through from the audience. We've extended by around 10 minutes, so please stay on. I know some of you have to leave, but we have a few more questions, and it's regarding digitalization and, of course, importantly, just access to information, which Murad has alluded to. So here's the one question, which I'm going to integrate in the final round of questions to all the panelists before we say goodbye. Digitalization may lead to less human power in decision-making by automating processes and making information available in a transparent way. What consequences will that have? Is it net positive, net negative? I would like to go to you, Adil, on that. It's kind of a heavy question, but I think it also speaks to what we're trying to achieve today, is becoming more tech savvy in the way that we deal with governance and transparency issues.
Yes, indeed. Just because the time is short, I'm going to tackle one specific aspect, positive aspect of digitization, which is that in early stages of development, as Pranab Bardhan had noted, there are lots of coordination failures, and you need an important role of the state in solving those coordination failures. One of the ways, very concrete ways in which digitization can improve transparency and improve state capacity is in integrating various databases. And this we saw in the middle of the pandemic too. If you want to deliver resources to vulnerable populations, you need to know which sectors they work, you need to know whether they are already on social payment registers, you need to know whether they're educated or not. So you can, typically, a lot of these states have huge repositories of information on individuals. And one of the ways in which digitization can help is in consolidating these databases and using advanced data analytics to improve state capacity, so that the state knows where those resources are most needed, who are the most well-targeted people. And I think that, to me, as a political economist, is a fascinating new intervention. It's a bit like the postal service or the railway service way back in time. This is another way in which the state can reach out, not just in geographic terms, but in demographic terms, in terms of vulnerability. And that potential is there, including for tax reform and on fiscal elements.
Thank you very much, Adil. Dima. Exciting new innovations, fighting corruption.
I mean, okay, in terms of fighting corruption and how technology can help, I would say that technology like artificial intelligence, for example, when it could be used by fiscal institutions like banks and financial institutions in tracking anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism, it might help identify and link to those characteristics of entities identified as at risk, instead of applying a one-size-fits-all regulation that would, for example, exclude some entities from financial services and lead to financial, a shortcoming in the financial inclusion. I think a couple of two main points here is that with digital technology is related to how states would also need or consider basically cyber security issues, addressing these, and also the issue of inclusion, making sure that there is some sort of agreement or memorandum of understandings maybe with service providers and the like, that when it comes to serving certain marginalized groups, maybe some sort of different provisions would apply to make sure that marginalized groups are included, in the process. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Jihad, wouldn't it be nice if you had a mechanism at the IMF to watch exactly what countries are spending the money you give them on?
Well,
no, dollar by dollar.
No, we are definitely working on that. And there are new technologies being used in order to have a better mapping of budget execution, as well as also increase the level of transparency and the level of audit of both budget, financial institutions, but also there is a group that we did not discuss a lot today, is the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, that also constitute an important portion of the operation of the state. But going back to your question of technology or digitalization, the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated a trend that existed before. And therefore, I think we are now in the digital age. And there are, for me, 3 pluses, 1 minus. First plus is transactions. Digitization is showing that we can accelerate, improve the quality of the transactions and provide service to people in their home. And this is one issue that people were facing in terms of dealing with the state, one of the sources of corruption. Second is the way we use information. We now have a multiplicity of sources of information where with artificial intelligence and other form of technology we can use, and we can improve our analysis, but also improve our capacity to analyze and audit. 3 is we have in technology today certain number of accelerations like mobile money, like mobile education and mobile healthcare services. And those are 3 important service level dimensions for the citizen everywhere they are. Those are the 3 pluses I see. The minus or the issue I see is inequality in access to technology. And this is where the risk is to have a divide for those who have access to technology and those who don't have access to technology. And this is something we see in low-income countries, in countries in fragility, but also we see within the same society. And this could become one of the main injustices in the future. We will see kids who have the capacity to get educated wherever they are, and those who don't have access to technology not even being able to access education. Therefore, I think one of the priority going forward is how to make sure that this new accelerated wave of technology and technological improvement is something that will benefit all and will allow all to use it as a means to transact, but also as a way to participate. And participation is very important. Technology proved also to be a way for people to participate and also as citizens to control and to exercise the right of oversight.
I had one last question to you, and then we're wrapping up. And I think for me, it's one of the most vital. If we see our governments failing and not being transparent, and you're seeing governance fail during this very important time, are we at risk of more upheaval? And I know you were alluding to it, that we've been seeing, some of the metrics showing that since 2017, you've seen an increase in unrest. What is at stake here? So governments need to listen because there's a lot at stake.
Well, Eleni, the issue is vulnerabilities are increasing. I think Murad said it in the beginning also, and others. We started since 2017 through our indicator of civil and social unrest to see an increase in tension or in risks in the region. The COVID-19 crisis proved to be one of those stressing moments where vulnerable groups are made even more at risk. Those who are in the informal sector, youth, women, displaced groups, those groups are at risk today and they need to be protected. We see also a risk of not having certain groups of the population benefiting from the recovery. And therefore, I think it's a very important for the region to use this moment as a transformative moment. And improving governance is one of the ways that even if you have relative means, that you show your citizen that you have the right policies and you're going in the right direction. And trust is built around that. Capacity to measure the state performance is built around that. Incentive and pressure also on the various categories, political elite, civil servants, and other categories who benefit from public procurement is to see that there is control over their actions, and they need to be not only have the goodwill, but also they need to report and be accountable. Therefore, I think it's a defining moment for the region, and we cannot afford losing a decade of I would say rebuilding the gap that could be created out of this crisis. If we go back to the global financial crisis, it took the region more than other parts of the world to recover to the post global financial crisis level. I think we need here to put all the efforts from different parties to reduce this gap and make sure that the countries of the region can recover, can address scarring, and can very quickly use this moment as a transformative moment.
Jihad, thank you very much for those insights. A big thank you to you, Adil, Dima, and Murad. Thank you very much for shedding light on some of the most important issues that we should all be paying attention to as we start this new year. A lot of hiccups as we started 2021. I think many were hoping that it would be slightly better, but we still are hopeful. And I wish all of you a very happy and prosperous new year. And I wish you one of health and immense success. To all of you, to the audience members, thank you very much to the IMF for putting this together. And I wish you all the best. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.